We thank the glorious introduction, and I say thank you. It's always fun to be back at Stanford, and it's fun to be in this particular lecture hall. I gave a talk here many years ago, so it's kind of fun to be back knocking around Stanford again. Michael is right. This is not a talk about what my lab does. If you're interested in that, you can send me email. This is actually me starting to think about my next project, and I'm really sort of interested in starting to think about our relationships with, through, and of technology. This is really a talk about the kind of construction of the socio-technical imagination. This isn't a talk about ethnography. This isn't a talk about HCI. So you're going to have to bear with me because I'm going to take you on a rapid and somewhat fast-paced journey through the last 500 years of history. So those of you who didn't pay attention in other classes, you're going to be really grateful to me when we're done because you're going to know a whole lot of people you didn't know about beforehand. Lots of ways to introduce me. Michael certainly gave you one. I am indeed the Director of Interaction and Experience Research at Intel. I have been at Intel 15 years, 2 weeks ago. My job there has always been to bring stories from outside the building into the building and to talk about what it is that motivates people, what they care about, what frustrates them, what's important to them, what they wish for their families and their kids and their communities and their cultures. And then we use all of that at Intel to help shape the next generation of technology production. I came to Intel in a kind of roundabout way. I was indeed an anthropologist. I did my PhD here. I studied Native American Studies as my undergraduate degree. And then in true Australian fashion, I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998. The bar is sadly long gone. And the man did not marry me, which was good also. But he did introduce me to Intel and to a different set of preoccupations. But long before I did that, I'm also the child of an anthropologist. So I grew up on my mother's field sites in Central and Northern Australia. I spent most of the 1970s and 1980s living with Indigenous people who remembered their country before white fellas came and who at the drop of a hat would take my brother and I bush, and we spent most of, well, my childhood not in school, not wearing shoes, not speaking English, and killing anything around me that moved for my supper. Thus far, none of those skills have stood me in good stead at Intel. I remain hopeful. It turns out if you know how to get water out of frogs, it's a good line for cocktail party conversation. It has not yet helped me innovate new technology. But it does mean I have spent pretty much all of my life thinking about culture, and increasingly over the last 15 or 20 years thinking about its relationship to technology. And when I think about the notion of the fact that my work at Intel, and indeed many of us who work in the HCI field, our work is to think about what that intersection looks like, right? And to think about how it is we shape technologies and technical systems that will in some ways comport to humans rather than making humans do all the work the other way around. But I think in addition to the practical work of building technologies and building systems, there's also a piece that all of us engage in, and you will engage in as you leave this building and you go into the rest of your lives, is that it's also about shaping the imagination. It's not just about physically building things, it's about what are the stories we tell about what technology does. What are the stories we tell and are told about our relationships to technology? And I want to kind of think of that as the work of the socio-technical, the work of the kind of the imaginary new world that we are all talking about, the future we are perennially designing for. And there are lots of ways to think about this. I was in England last week, and William Gibson put this on Twitter, and I thought it was a kind of fabulous line. Here is William Gibson saying he woke up from a dream in which he appeared to be entirely in Google Street Views. Now, those of you who don't know William Gibson, he is, probably one of our more distinguished social science writers. He certainly gave us a whole series of tropes that many of us operate in today when we think about how data is configured, when we think about our relationships to many things. William Gibson is one of them, who helped shape those. And it is fascinating to me to imagine that here is a man who finds himself in some ways held hostage to a system, and a socio-technical one at that. So when I think about charting the socio-technical imagination, I think about the stories we tell about technology. This was a starting point for me. But truthfully, when I really started thinking about this work, it had to do with this. So this is a piece of video that turned up on YouTube at this point about 2 Christmases ago, so in December of, what would that be, 2011. It showed a Furby. Most of you in this room are not old enough to remember the original one, but it was a little talky thing, and its little eyelashes flashes, and its ears went and made a horrible squeaking sound. This is a Furby talking to Siri, so Apple's first generation speech recognition personal assistant object. This is 47 seconds of video in which predictably the Furby goes, ah! And Siri says, "Would you like me to call Shell Oil?" And the Furby goes, ah, 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 ah. And Siri says something to the effect of, I can't find Graham in your address book. Now, this is obviously funny, but it also captured me and I couldn't let go of it. And I spent multiple days wanting to show this video to everyone I knew. And I realized that part of what made it appealing to me is that this is actually not just an amusing piece of video. This is in fact encoding a very particular moment in our relationships to technology. Because this is actually about genealogy, right? This is about 3 different kinds of genealogy. The first one is, this is a story about talking things. It's like granddaddy talking thing and baby talking thing. Because clearly the Furby and the Siri, slightly more sophisticated in that, generational transformation, right? It's also a genealogy in the classic anthropological sense. So think the tree of humanity, where we have basically Neanderthal talking thing and Homo sapien talking thing, where there's a clear and structural difference. But it turned out there was another thing going on in this that only became clear to me when I started to talk to the engineers that I work with at Intel. Because I said to them, this is fabulous. And they're like, that's nice. And I'm like, no, it's really very cool. They're like, that's nice. I'm like, no, there's something going on here. Because what we have in the difference between the Furby and the Siri is the difference between talking and listening. The Furby talks, what the Siri proposes to do is listen. Talk also, but listen, because the talking is a response to the listening. And as soon as you have that transformation, you have the promise of something that listens to you. It's effectively, for better or worse, and in this case possibly not implemented excellently, it is the promise of something that has a relationship with you, because it's listening to you and responding to you. Ultimately, it is something that promises to take care of you. It will anticipate your needs and deliver something to you. And I went to my engineers and I said, listen, I think this is imperfectly pointing to the beginning of a move from human-computer interaction to human-computer relationships. And that what this actually does is signal the beginning of a significant paradigm shift in the way we ought to be thinking about ourselves and machines. And my engineers, who are lovely people, said to me, no. I'm like, what do you mean, no? They're like, nope. I'm like, why no? They're like, well, if we have a relationship with machines, nothing good will come of it. I'm like, what does that mean? They're like, well, if machines are smart enough to have a relationship with us, you know what happens next. And I'm like, no. They're like, death. Like, I'm sorry, how have we gone from human-computer interaction to death? And they're like, it's really quite simple. As soon as they're smart enough to take care of us, they're smart enough to kill us. And I realized that what this was also pointing to me was a third thing, right? This was also about a genealogy of anxiety. That somehow we had gotten to a moment where we could do this in our heads. We could go from happy, perky Furby, who really doesn't mean a lot of harm, to Siri, who's voice recognition, to that. Because that's what people were doing. There was a slippage and a slippery slope that went from saying, it's fine for an object to talk, it's probably okay for an object to listen. At the moment an object can start having a relationship with us and that object is a machine, death. And I'm like, wow. And so I spent the last 18 months trying to make sense of that, because that for me is a really interesting move, right? How do we chart where that fear comes from? Because rationally, you know, Siri does not want to kill you. The Furby definitely didn't want to kill you. Chances are Google Plus doesn't want to kill you either. So why is it that we imagine that they are portents of like the end of the world, or at least the end of us? And I realized that part of what's going on here is what I actually think is the first move that happens, the move that gets us to a moment of fearing a relationship is actually about the death of magic. And to get to that moment, you have to go back in time. And you have to look at the emergence of 3 critical technologies in the 1600s, late 1500s, early 1600s, that profoundly shaped our relationships to the world. The first one of those objects is actually the watch. This is the very first watch, somewhere from the mid-1500s, talking about 1530 here. Before 1530, if you lived in pretty much any major metropolitan center around the world, there were different ways by which time was reckoned. If you lived in the West, you lived in a medieval village or a medieval city-state town. There was a large clock tower somewhere in that town. It was possibly associated with a church, and it chimed the time. It told you that it was the middle of the day. It sometimes told you it was time to pray. If you were in that township, you heard time. Time was something you couldn't escape. It happened, over a 300-year period. We went from time being a very diffuse thing to clock towers that originally started in churches and then become secular things. But if you lived in a town, which indeed was where most people lived in the 1500s, you heard time. Time was around you. If you lived in other parts of the world, there were other ways of knowing time. There were other kinds of clocks. In Islamic countries, there were water clocks. Those also made time visible in all kinds of ways, right? But you had to go to see that time or hear it. What the watch does is time suddenly becomes personal. Time now follows you. You know what time it is when you don't hear the time because you have the time in your pocket. And effectively, you start to be regulated by that notion of time because there are obligations about it. As soon as you carry time with you, you have no excuse for being tardy. If you carry a watch, not only does it say that you know how to be timely, but it says you care about punctuality. And a whole kind of notion here of what had in some ways been diffuse and free-floating, i.e. the notion of time, suddenly regulates us. So along comes the watch. Time is on our bodies. Sure, initially it starts that time is only in the hands of wealthy people. But it turns out you don't need to have that much time in the hands of wealthy people before most people can get close to time, because it's like early cell phones. Not everyone needed to have them, but everyone knew what they looked like and everyone had made a call. So the first thing that happens to start making magic disappear is that we put time in our hands. Second thing is a man named Galileo, riffing on some technology that had been built by some of his colleagues 6 months before in a different city for a different king, effectively invents something called the telescope. And the telescope makes possible the second important piece of the death of magic, because what the telescope lets us know is where our place in the world is. So in 1608 through 1609 through 1610, the leaders of many European nations find themselves gazing through a little tiny metal hole into the rest of the world, into the rest of this entire kind of planetary system. And one of the consequences of that over the next 40 or 50 years is that we suddenly realize that the Earth is no longer the center of everything. The Earth is merely part of a much larger planetary system. And the decentering of Earth and of us, hugely important intellectual move. The third thing that happens in this same time period, about 10 years later, 15 years later, with again Galileo in play, is the invention of the microscope. And suddenly, same lens technology, what happens? We become able to examine the world around us. Not the planetary scale, but effectively not quite yet, but the molecular scale. And we start to see that all these things that seemed unknowable can be dissected down into little tiny component pieces. And what appeared to be, in some ways, unknowable becomes infinitely knowable. And the first thing that gets taken apart is an insect, where we suddenly discover there are all these pieces inside the insect that look a little bit like the pieces inside people and look a lot like other things that we can start to know. And the microscope starts to be a way of unpacking the world around us. The constellation of all of those things, of the personalizing of time, of a capacity to know our place in the world and know what the world around us happens, signals a really important intellectual shift in the post-Enlightenment world. It signals effectively the beginning of the scientific revolution. A revolution we're all still living in, right? A moment that said we can make sense of the world. We can know things, we can chart things, we can start to see the rules by which the world operates on a massive scale and on a micro scale. And we can start to see the patterns. We can start to hypothesize rules. We can start to say when this happens, this other thing happens, or inside this is this thing here, and that thing is inside other things too. And suddenly what had been deeply mysterious becomes knowable and known. And the project of knowing things, of making sense of things, is a project that arguably has occupied the West for, well, nearly 400 years since then. But in 1636, and this for me is the kind of, in some ways, the nail in the coffin of magic. In 1636, Descartes says, first in French and then in Latin, which is interesting, so he's writing for his colleagues before he writes for the intelligentsia, he says, I think, therefore I am, and creates the moment where the most important thing about being human is our cognitive capacity. It's our capacity for rational thought. It's our capacity to make this notion of the scientific revolution true. It is our capacity for knowing things. It's not I feel, therefore I am. It's not I emote, therefore I am. It's not I am God's child, therefore I am. It is I think, therefore I am. And in this moment, moving forward in the 1600s, what you see is a progressive sense that we can make sense of the world and that the quest to make sense of the world is good. One of the other remarkable unintended consequences of that move is that the notion of things being magical, of unknowable things, of things being mysterious, of things moving to their own accord, is done. Some people talk about this as the moment we killed God, which is probably putting too fine a point on it. But there is a really interesting thing here that happens as we start to privilege cognition, rationality, science, and we start to decommit magic and things that are unknowable, because frankly anything that's magic ought to be able to be scrutinized and then made sense of. So we have this kind of extraordinary moment of the death of magic. Yes, sir?
So all this is really framed around knowing things that are natural systems that pre-existed us. And I feel like where you're going is about design systems.
Yeah, so if you just hold your horses, I'll get you there.
All right.
So we have killed magic, and then we birth fear. Welcome to the appearance of designed systems. It's like you can be my straight man. Want to come on the road with me? It's excellent. So you kill magic, you start to create technologies, and those technologies proliferate. And from the 1500s into the 1600s, there is a proliferation of machinery and technologies, built systems. To the contemporary moment, we know that this headline, not an unusual one. Your coffee machine could attack you at any time. So somehow we got to that, right? And I think there's a series of technical moves that get us there. First one has to do with a surplus of pieces. So watchmakers in the 1600s and clockmakers had what the tech field would recognize. They had basically built as many watches and clocks as there were people who could buy them. And they needed to expand their market. It had also been a very profitable place, so there were lots of watchmakers and clockmakers who were like, well, shit, everyone's built all the watches and clocks, now what do we do? So lots of people who are good with fiddly bits, nowhere to put their fiddly bits, kind of an issue. And there are a series of people who appear in the early to late 1600s, but really this comes to the fore in the 1700s, who made automatons, who basically took the thing that was interesting about a watch and a clock, it was self-powered, it moved, you could wind it up and it did things, and started to reconfigure those from being watches to being objects. And there's a series of these, many of you have heard of them. There are a series of small dolls that danced. When you wound them up, they danced. There were little children that wrote out scripts. They're kind of fun. There were things that played violins. There were a whole series of automatons. But probably the most famous, and I would argue most interesting of the automaton makers was a man named Jacques de Vaucanson. He was French, starting in the early sort of mid-1720s. He went on a big binge of building stuff. And he was really interested in achieving verisimilitude. He wanted stuff that felt real. So his first, one of his many first things was a flautist, a flute player. And in order to get the sound that a flute makes when fingers hit the strike keys, he realized he needed to glove the mechanical hand in skin. Creepy. He used cowhide, just in case you're briefly worried about what you might glove mechanical hands in the 1600s. The answer is, cowhide, but he wanted the feel of flesh hitting the keys, hitting the strikes on a flute, right? Because that was, as far as he was concerned, important. This object, however, is the one that makes him, well, deeply special. So in 1736, he released on the world something called Le Canard Digesteur, the digesting duck. So how many of you in the room have actually been in the presence of a duck? Okay, good. I made a room full of people do that recently, and like 2/3 of the room had never been near a duck. And I'm like, how is that possible? Like, who are you people? All right, so good. You know about ducks. That is important because this duck is particularly special. So this duck is duck size. So, ducky. It waddles, which is good. Vaucanson took advantage of a new technology that appeared in Europe at the time that no one knew what to do with, which was vulcanized rubber. Because it was really important to him that in addition to waddling, this duck, little beak went clack, clack, clack. He thought you should be able to feed this duck. Thought that would be excellent. Well, it turned out, in order to make digestion sound right, you couldn't use metal pipes because they rusted. So that was bad. So he actually made vulcanized rubber intestines for this duck. So far, so good, right? So this duck waddles, this duck's beak goes clack, 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 and you can stick food in this duck's mouth. And then the duck digests. Now, those of you who've been around ducks know what happens next. Come on. Feed duck, digest duck, then what happens? Exactly. Now, in order to achieve the appropriate level of duckness here, Vaucanson had to do something, because it turns out you couldn't actually fake digestion in 1736. That was a bridge too far. He had a separate shit cache inside the duck. Oh yeah, so you fed the duck, it went into one stomach, he collected duck poo, and the duck poo came out the other end as the duck moved. Genuinely excellent, right? I mean, total duckness here. This is like as duck as it gets. Walks like a duck, talks like a duck, shits like a duck. Splendid, right? This duck was regarded as being quite miraculous because it was as duck-like as you could possibly imagine in the 1630s, right? It did all the things we knew how ducks do, and it did it appearingly on its own kind of steam, its own mechanized motion, right? Voltaire said of this duck that without this duck there was no glory for France. I know, that may say something about Voltaire, but it is still nonetheless an excellent line. But this notion of creating something real, of attempting to create something that felt real, hugely important, right? And here, watches that had been about standardizing time become about how do we start to make things real, right? And of course, much of the language about time and watches was also about, was time a thing that flowed through us? Did it have a kind of spirit to it? So here, the mechanization, the winding piece of this was about how do we start to make things real, right? So this duck is the first attempt at making things real. Unsurprisingly, there are a whole series of things after this. This duck kind of waddles across the stages of Europe for at least a decade. Vaucanson then decides he wants to be taken more seriously and destroys the duck, which is very sad. So the only accounts we have of this duck are the narrative accounts of this duck, and Voltaire, who was deeply obsessed with this duck, as previously kind of alluded to. Vaucanson goes on, possibly unsurprisingly, to take his interest in mechanization to make loom technology and punch cards. Cleans up his act, gets into the real game, right? But this notion of things that wind up, this notion of what it might take to start to make things that look like real things, important kind of intellectual move, right? So can we make things that feel real, and what are the consequences of doing that? By the time we get to the 20th century, Freud et al. Are starting to worry about the uncanny valley and about, Freud's not worrying about the uncanny valley, Freud's just worrying about the uncanny. And what does it mean to have things that look like this? And, frankly, he's in no small part influenced by Edison's talking doll. If you have not seen that one, you will not get out your laptops right now unless you already have them out. You will Google Edison's talking doll in YouTube and you will see the doll. She is terrifying. You can hear the doll sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and you will never sleep again. It is literally the most frightening thing I have ever heard, and she's a terrifying thing. Anyway, so we start with wind-up toys, right? That notion of mechanization gets very big and very impactful very quickly. So the duck is 1636. By 1812, June of 1812, there are a series of break-ins in cloth-making factories in England. Men break into the factories and smash the looms. That is correct, but no one knew who they were at that point. They knew, the men who were smashing the looms, that this was dangerous. The people who owned the factories were determined. They had a lot of money. They had the law on their side. They were creating a new form of work. This was effectively the beginning of the heating up of the Industrial Revolution. The men who were breaking these looms also knew that it was criminal trespass they were engaging in and that it was dangerous. The people who owned the factories got the police involved, and this became a fairly significant moment. Interestingly, the men who were doing the smashing knew that they needed a leader. They knew they needed someone who they could basically put in charge. They also knew if they actually put someone in charge, that person would be hauled off. So they created a leader. They called him Ned Ludd, sometimes General Ned Ludd. 1812 is also the height of the Romantic poets in England, and the Robin Hood story was just being retold again. So suddenly Robin Hood had gone out of vogue for quite some time, about 400 years when no one really cared about the Robin Hood story. Starting in the early 1800s, Robin Hood is back with a vengeance. We're very excited by Robin Hood. It's a nice tale. It's got, the happy English countryside. It's got despotic barons. It's excellent, right? It's a good story, women being saved by men. It's all very, it's excellent. So General Ned Ludd takes up residence in Robin Hood's cave in Sherwood Forest, from which he proceeds to issue a series of fairly didactic manifestos. It is also clear, because we're talking about 1812 and there is no YouTube and no Twitter, that they need to work out how to circulate information very quickly. And because many of the people who would ultimately smash looms weren't necessarily literate, there is a challenge about how you distribute that news. And so the people who created Ned also created a series of songs And those songs were sung up and down the coasts of England, pub to pub, meeting to meeting. And the songs encoded where the looms were vulnerable, how you could break the looms. So think of them as basically hashtags. I mean, this is effectively what this was. It was the distribution of knowledge before there was an obvious chain to do it. And while the loom smashers were singing the songs of how to smash the looms, the gentry, the intelligentsia, the aristocracy, the loom owners are reading about the smashing on page 1, page 2, and page 3 of the Times of London, where this was being discussed every single day, where there was an index of smashed looms, there were remarks about the damage that was being done. This became the cultural conversation of that summer. Lord Byron, one of the big romantic poets, a man in some ways who ought to be best remembered by the epitaph given to him by one of his many jilted lovers. Lady Charlotte Lamb once described Byron as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Like the quintessential bad boy of the early 1800s, right? He gets up in an attempt arguably to rebrand his reputation, and his maiden speech in the House of Lords is a defense of the Luddites. And the Luddites as the last great defenders of the true English way of life. Now, of course, we know these people because we know the word. We know the name of their movement, right? They're the Luddites. We think of Luddites as being the word to describe people who are anti-technology. It's not clear they were anti-technology. They were certainly anti the loss of their labour. They were certainly anti the loss of, their kind of right to be productive. But the notion of smashing the looms and of breaking the technology and that idea, that word has carried forward for 200 years, long past a revolution that lasted less than 18 months. So right about a month ago, 200 years ago, so in August of 1813, loom smashing was criminalised in a new way. It wasn't just about crimes of property. It became effectively an act of treason, punishable by death or transportation to Australia. Surprising number of people chose death, which to this day blows my mind, although the ones who came to Australia basically jump-started our trade union movement, so we're always pretty grateful for that. And the Luddite movement kind of dissipates. But there is an 18-month period where all anyone in England is talking about, in conjunction with the introduction to new machinery, is the consequences of that introduction. It's a machinery about loss. It's a machinery about pollution. So think the dark satanic mills is a line that comes out of this same time period, right? So design systems bring with them chaos. And replacement of things human, replacement of work, replacement of value, replacement of labour, replacement of meaning. And the conversations about that reaction are the only things people are talking about in England for this entire period of time. Which is relevant because of the next piece of the story about where fear comes from. So in 1816, Byron, he gets around. Byron is pretty much all about the next 100 years of this story, right? So Byron and his best mate and his doctor and his best mate's girlfriend and his best mate's girlfriend's half-sister. If this starts to sound like the Cardassians, you are not wrong. So Byron, the doctor, the girlfriend's half-sister, the other friend, all go off to tour Europe to spend some time on the continent. It's kind of a shitty summer. The weather is bad. There's been a volcanic eruption. The entire of the summer of 1816 is kind of a summer of clouds and dust and bad weather. And somewhere in the middle of that summer in Switzerland, at a dinner party, Byron says, in the way you can only say if you were part of the British aristocracy, that he is frightfully, frightfully bored. And it would be awfully nice if someone would tell him a story that would make him less bored. I'm like, okay, fine. So pretty much everyone at that dinner party scatters to the winds of whatever, piece of mad real estate they are camped out in. And in that moment, 3 of the most important tropes for horror are born. Because Byron's doctor writes the first vampire story. Byron's best mate's girlfriend's half-sister writes the first zombie story. And Byron's best mate's girlfriend, who we all know as Mary Shelley, writes Frankenstein. And give birth to one of the perennial tropes and moral stories of, it turns out, our day as well as this day. So Mary Shelley is a remarkable young woman. You know who she is. Mary Shelley is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was arguably the very first suffragette in England. She was a woman who, in the 1700s, was arguing that women should have equal rights to men. ticking on any day now. So there is Mary Wollstonecraft advocating for that. Mary's husband, a man named Wilson, was the preeminent labour historian in England in 1812 and 1813. Mary at that point was about 14 years old, but the entire conversation around her dining room table was about the Luddites and about machinery and about the consequences of making of machinery. When her boyfriend of the time, a man named Percy Shelley, who would later become her husband, set about wooing her, he took her to see things in London. He took her to Egypt Hall or Egyptian Hall, which was the place where automatons were on display. It was a place to see experiments in mesmerism and vivisection and early electricity. It was a place to see frogs dissected and have a charge run through them so they appeared to come back to life. It was a place of seeing all, effectively, the TED Talks of the day. I mean, I really don't know how else to think about it. It was basically like a bunch of TED Talks, but with frogs, which, may make a better TED Talk, unclear. So here she is enmeshed in these stories about and experiments in electricity. Whole series of European theorists are now arguing that electricity is the lifeblood. It is the next kind of metaphor for thinking about the body, for thinking about what animates everything. She also knows that, you can take stuff apart and put it back together, just not very successfully. And, in the Frankenstein story, it is Frankenstein as a scientist who collects body parts, stitches them together, runs electricity through it, and the object comes to life. Frankenstein's monster, and it lumbers around and attempts to work out how to be human. It thinks it's human. It has a human brain, not an abnormal brain, a human brain. And so it wanders off attempting to find human beings to work out how to make itself more human. Peers through a hole in the wall and watches a family for days. But ultimately, as human beings, we reject the monster. The monster has a fairly bad response to that, and what does it try to do? It tries to kill us. Oh, hello. What should be an immediately familiar story. Now, this story, when it came out, hugely controversial. There was an argument about whether Mary had written it herself. Maybe it was Percy, maybe it was Byron. But this story has been in constant print since 1816. It was the subject of some of the very first movies. It has been the subject of television shows. It has been the subject of more spoofs than we can poke a stick at. And it is deeply embedded in our consciousness as both a moral play, but also as language to make sense of things that don't quite work, right? We talk about things being Frankensteined together as a kind of bad mishmash. But this notion here of human beings making life and of life not really thinking that's a good idea is a really interesting and important story. And it goes on to shape ultimately what happens for the next 150, 200 years. About 35 years later, 40 years later, there is a man in London whose name is Babbage. He is a bit of a ne'er-do-well. He is a gambler. He is kind of a repeat offender startup before there was Sand Hill Road to go to. He created a plan for effectively taking all the mechanization he had seen up until that day and doing something more with it. So looms made fabric, but he started to realize if you had mechanization, maybe you could not just reproduce literal things, maybe you could get to a level of abstraction. So not make a pattern, but what if that pattern became something else, right? Could you effectively create a new grammar or a new language? He was trying to think about, could machines get us to abstraction? He is starting to create computing. He creates half a machine. The machine is ultimately not built until the 1990s, but he has a plan for the machine. He publishes it. It gets circulated around England. There was a young woman who had been, consciously by her mother, raised as the first child of the modern age. She'd never read any poetry. She'd never been exposed to any art. All she had read was science and math. She had science and math tutors. When she ran into Babbage and the Babbage machine, she immediately recognized something that we would all recognize, which is the machine was only as good as the first program that was written for it, that it was excellent to have abstraction, but the abstraction needed to be tamed and manipulated in some way. You all should know that woman because that is Ada Lovelace. She is arguably the world's first computer programmer, and she happens to be Byron's daughter. Told you, he got around. She writes the first program. There's a whole lot of things that happen as a result of this. This machine lies dormant in some ways as an idea. There are proliferations of it through the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. And in the middle of the 20th century, with the outbreak of World War II, in England, the premier mathematicians of the country are pulled together into a single place called Bletchley Park, and they are given one job and one job alone. And their job is to crack the enigma. It's to crack the code. Is to work out how it is that information is being transmitted by particularly the Germans, to their various military forces in a code that seems uncrackable by all the previous mechanisms there are. And some of those mathematicians start thinking this is a problem that is beyond the capacity of one human brain. They need to actually create a level of a capacity to think more than that. And they go back to Babbage and they build what is effectively the first computer. One of the principal people architecting that was a young British mathematician born and raised in India, educated in the UK, a man of tremendous mathematical talent and rather a lot of social awkwardness. His name, as many of you know, is Alan Turing. Alan Turing is an incredibly important part of what happens at Bletchley Park, is an incredibly important part of creating the first generation of computation. He's also a character with incredible complexity. Alan Turing was gay in a time when being gay was kind of socially unacceptable and deeply politically complicated. He was gay in a time when being gay was thought of as a mechanism by which you could be immediately blackmailed. So at the point at which he was caught in a compromising position, he was offered a choice by the British government if he wanted to maintain his security clearance. And the choice was effectively hormonal castration or a stripping of his security clearance and an ejection from Bletchley Park and all of his work. He initially agreed to be dosed with hormones. He ultimately found that to be a really unpleasant experience. And he stopped taking them. He was caught again, and he was taken away from everything he loved. He was considered to be a risk to the British government, a risk to security. He was kicked out of Bletchley Park. He was kicked out of all of the research he was done, and he was told he was never allowed to work on any of it again. Done. For many people, that would have been an awful end of a life's career. Ultimately, for Turing, it liberated him to publish what is probably one of the most important papers in artificial intelligence, because it's the one that kicks the whole thing off in 1950. He publishes a paper called Can a Machine Think? It is a philosophical paper as much as it is a paper of computer science. It is a paper that in its mere title is an utter provocation. If you entitle a paper, Can a Machine Think? Even if you're English, you're rhetorically allowing for the answer that the answer might be yes. It wasn't, the machine will never think or no machines think. It was, can a machine think? And the paper sets out the conditions by which we will be able to prove that thought has happened. We know this is the Turing test. The Turing test will be passed when a person standing on one side of the wall can no longer distinguish whether on the other side of the wall there is a computer and a machine, a computer and a person, right? So the point you ask a series of questions and you can no longer tell the difference between where the answers are coming from, the Turing test will be passed. Turing test has not yet been passed, but its consequences run through computer science as well as a whole series of other branches of science. Partly because what it says is that one of the goals of science is to create human thought, right? We need to have something that is indistinguishable from humans. And what does he think indistinguishable is? It has to think like a person. So, back to Descartes again, right? We have circled back quite some way. What is also in some ways more important is that this paper and the question it poses end up also shaping our imagination in really powerful ways, because this paper is profoundly influential in science fiction. And ultimately, if you didn't know the Turing test, you have in fact seen it, even though you all seem impossibly young. Because at some point you saw the movie Blade Runner on television. And in that movie, there is a moment where the machines thwart a system to prove whether they are human or not. And they don't thwart it by their capacity to think, they thwart it by their capacity to have memories, to have a moral compass, to have an emotional core. That movie is based on a novella written by Philip K. Dick, who was an American author from the Bay Area, who took Turing's paper and understood its core impulse, which was a question about not whether machines think, but what makes us human. And the novella Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is an exploration precisely about what makes us human. But it's also the story that helps again reinforce and shape the notion of the fear of the machines, right? Because if a machine can think, what does that say about us? If you start by saying, I think, therefore I am, and the machine thinks also, there is an interesting consequence for that, right? So for me, you can get pretty straightforward from, Descartes to Philip K. Dick. You can get from I think, therefore I am to if thinking, then not helpful. And you can see that there is a really clear reason why we have a set of responses that we have, right? Why we think it's dangerous. Because we have science, science fiction, literary tropes, political histories, all of which encode a particular set of ideas, right? Not all of them rational, but all of them ideas that have lived in our imaginations in really dramatic ways. They have lived in movies, they have lived in political discourse, they have lived in language. They haunt, right? But what if you were to say, okay, well, I'm an anthropologist, and that's a very particular history. That is a slice of history as narrow as the West. That is a story about the Enlightenment. That is a story about technologies of the West. That is a story about a particular set of actors who operate in the post-Enlightenment, post-industrial revolution, Western tradition. What if you went and looked, if you could, at the same technologies in other places? Would they create the same moments of anxiety? And there's a couple of places you can go, right? You can go to some of the principal scientific and engineering documents in Islam. You can go look at the Book of Mechanical Wonders and the Book of Ingenious Mechanical Wonders, written in 820 and 1206 AD respectively. These are books that encode a series of mechanical objects. So think of them as pre-clock parts, but a whole series of objects that are designed to do certain kinds of work. These are pictures of water clocks. So for time telling, they have different things that happen. So rather than bells striking, it's birds that sing when the movement of the water happens across a series of objects. Sitting in these books are also a whole series of mechanical and mechanized objects to do things. But none of them are about Vaucanson's notion of simulacrum. They're not about verisimilitude. They're not about making objects to do the things, effectively making replicas of things. Right? They're not about making mechanical ducks that do duck things. There is a mechanized peacock in here, but it doesn't do anything peacocks do, because when you turn it upside down, water pours out of its mouth, and that does not happen with peacocks. But it is something, an object where water pours out of its mouth, that's hugely important for Salah, so that you can have your appropriate ablution, so you can wash your hands and feet before you pray. And this object means that the water comes out of a beautiful thing, the water never touches the ground, the water comes out of a bird's mouth. It is a mechanical object designed to be part of a particular set of religious practices, and it is not considered to be something that is faking life or about to replace us. And there's a very different scientific tradition that builds on top of this. But what if we wanted to take exactly the same technologies, the same ones that Vaucanson uses? Where would that get you? Well, fascinatingly enough, clocks got around. So in the 1500s, there was a surplus of clocks. Once you ran out of people you could sell clocks to, clocks became a gift you just gave to everyone, whether it was, socially or culturally appropriate or not. So a whole bunch of clocks get shipped from Europe to China as part of a whole, right, we'd like to, give you things you're going to find exciting. So a bunch of clocks that kind of went from Switzerland to Peking, where they were regarded with somewhat of wonder because they made bonging noises if you wound them up. So mostly they were wound so that they chimed. They were not wound so that they kept time. They became uninteresting after about 40 years and were promptly gifted on to other people. So the clocks of China ended up in Tokyo, where they were promptly taken apart and reverse engineered, demonstrating a particular orientation to technology that arguably has consistency. So these clocks are taken apart. It's kind of like, well, how the hell does that work? So they are stripped of all of their innards. The gears are reproduced. Some of the gears are made out of other things. People work out how to make the strikes out of whale bones. There's some fascinating stuff that happens, right? And there is one particular inventor, innovator, scientist in the Edo period who becomes really interested in this mechanization stuff and what you can do with it. And he proceeds to take those pieces and make a whole series of other objects. These objects have lots of names. The set of them I'm most familiar with are karakuri. So these things here, which are sometimes called automatons, they're sometimes called little robots. This one is a teacup karakuri. It is effectively a teacup bearing automaton. It's little, it's about this big. You put tea in its teacup and it runs across the tea table. When you take the teacup up, it runs backwards. It's excellent, it's beautiful. It is an object of exquisite grace. It is a beautiful thing. And it sits inside of a really important set of rituals amongst the Chinese aristocracy of the tea ceremony, which is a ritual about grace and relationships and a certain set of forms of aesthetic pleasure. So here is an object, same machinery, not about reproducing a thing that already happens, because there are not tiny people this big who run across tea tables distributing teacups. But it is an object that was seen to be a thing of wonder. It was a thing of grace. It was a thing of beauty. It is recorded across multiple pieces of the literature at this point of these objects. The man who built them has an entire blueprint book full of all the instructions for how to make it. And the leading roboticists in Japan got a hold of this book in the 1960s, and it took them 20 years to work out how to remake these things. But they set about making them because they were interested in what it said, right? Flash forward to the current period, and you see a very different landscape for technology in some ways. Same technology trajectory. So after the Edo period, you go through a rapid industrialization period, looms. The mechanizing of silk production happens in Japan. The same technology turns up. It is accompanied with a completely different discourse. There is no Luddite moment. By the time you get to the 20th century, you see an incredible proliferation of technologies, and in some ways that are genuinely fascinating. I found myself in Tokyo 18 months ago. I'm with some of my colleagues, and I see this sign out of the corner of my eye. And I get out of a moving vehicle. It's the joys of being an anthropologist. Every now and again, one is compelled to kind of do things that are possibly not helpful. Because this is just, I'm like, what the hell is this? I'm like, what are those robots doing to each other? There's so many questions. So I'm out of the car. I take a picture of this thing, and my colleagues from Intel kind of go, what are you doing? Get back in the car. And I'm like, what does it say? Like, it says it's a robot zone. Okay. What does it say in the bit I can't read? They said, oh, it says it's an autonomous robot zone and there are robots 2 meters in from the curb. Like, what are the robots doing? Like, they're 2 meters in from the curb. Like, whose robots? They're autonomous robots. What are the robots doing? Well, they're being autonomous. Aren't you worried? No, that's what the sign's here for. It'll tell us that they're 2 meters in from the curb. I'm like, oh, having one of those moments where you know that culturally speaking, you are not communicating. So I try one more time. I'm like, about the robots. They're like, yes, it's the sign. They're autonomous. I'm like, who do they belong to? They're like, they're autonomous. I'm like, what are they doing here? They're 2 meters in from the curb. Aren't you concerned about this? No, that's what the sign is for. I'm like, okay. Deep breath. I'm like, all right, can I try this a different way? They're like, sure. I'm like, were we in America, there might be some anxiety about autonomous robots running around. They're like, but that's what the sign's here for. They're like, fine, you know, these guys know me well. They're like, what is your problem? I'm like, I think Americans might be concerned the robots were going to hurt them. And they're like, oh, that's just science fiction. Like, the robots are our friends. And then proceeded to unpack for me a whole history of Japanese television, Japanese political discourse, Japanese iconography, everything from Astro Boy to a whole series of pieces of anime and many other things that we see the glimpses of. That technology here was being understood as part of the Japanese psyche, as part of the Japanese landscape, not as apart from it and not as a replacement to it. When you look at the trajectory of robot adoption in Japan, you see not only robots in industry, you see them in small to medium business, you see them in nursing homes, you see them in schools, you see some of them are deeply humanoid, some of them are not. There is an entire spectrum here that is happening, and it is very rare that the language that is accompanied by it is that it will kill us. When you go and push on, you know, the kind of primary writers in the Japanese tradition, who are the roboticists, you know, the principal one talks about the fact that robots stand a better chance of achieving Buddhahood than people do because robots are capable of infinite patience and a perpetual state of grace, basically, in the Catholic sense. So there's a very different idea here about what it means to think about technology. Same technology, different set of cultural discourses. Same origins, different set of stories it gets attached to. So how do you start to think about that together, right? Well, one of them is to realize that not all technologies produce fear even locally. So my favorite American technology story of kind of stories of splendor and wonder is actually about the early introduction of electricity in the United States. So as many of you, I'm sure, know, when electricity is introduced in the US, first it starts on the coasts in the big cities. People literally go to see electricity. So there were bus tours arranged from the Midwest so that you would go overnight to go to New York to see the lights on Broadway. That's what that expression is actually about. It's about going to see the lights. Not the shows, but the lights, because like Broadway was lit up and that was kind of nifty. Like the Great White Way was all about this notion of visiting electricity because you didn't have it in your hometown in the Midwest. So there are all these places where electricity became a thing you went to look at, right? It was effectively a spectacle and it was beautiful. It was always extraordinary, right? The flicker of light in the darkness, that moment where suddenly things are lit that have never been lit, is kind of this moment of remarkableness, right? And as electricity slowly marches off the coasts and into the sort of smaller towns, there is a moment in upstate New York in Niagara where the man who ran the local electricity plant had a surplus of electricity. There's a lot of stories of surplus in this. You know, he'd wired all the factories, he had leftover electricity, he wanted to convince the local population they could electrify their homes. And truthfully, in the early days, electricity was a bit of a hard sell. I mean, if you think that, you know, electricity was the infrastructure, the light bulb was its only killer app. And people already had light. They had gas, they had windows, they had candles. So you're kind of like, really? You want to drill a hole in my wall to give me this uncertain thing, and all it does is give me light? So there's a lot of resistance on the domestic side to having their homes electrified because, frankly, they already had light, and they mostly liked the light they had, and the whole electrical light thing wasn't particularly compelling. So for people who were selling electricity, they had to find a new way to connect the dots, right? So if you have this guy, he has a surplus of electricity, he decides that he needs to introduce the entire of the people who have money in his town to the wonders that are electricity, so he has parties in his house, as you do. He takes the ground floor of his very large house, and he lays track on the floor. Fine-grained, narrow track, metal. He hires a series of young women from the town. You can see where this is going if you're paying attention. He clamps them into the metal track with skates. He puts light bulbs in their hands, and he runs a volt through them. Now, electricity in the early days was only about 5 or 6 watts, so not really particularly painful. And they unexpectedly, because in fact we know this, they lit up. So these girls would skate around the downstairs of this floor with light bulbs in their hand and a current running through them to show that electricity was safe and beautiful. They were known as the electric fairies, which I still think has to be like the best line on a resume ever. What did you do in 1908? Electric fairy. 1908 to 1909. For a number of people for whom this was the first time they encountered electricity, this notion of running a current through your body was sort of an interesting one, right? We hadn't quite got to the point that you could kill people with electricity. You know, the electric chair was sort of lurking in this period too. But if you used a lower volt, you could do this. So there was a moment in the late, I want to say like 1910, 1911, where Mary Astor had a dress made for herself entirely stitched with light bulbs. And she had a metal conductive plate put at her front door. And when the doorbell rang, she used to stand on the plate and light up like a Christmas tree, which is really quite specky. So long before Christmas lights, she was her own Christmas tree. And for an even longer period after that, the kind of wealthy households in London had a doorbell girl who also stood on a conductive metal plate at the door, and when you pressed the doorbell, she lit up. I don't know what to tell you. It really did happen. So it was this moment, right, where technology is about, you know, even in this particular place, like technology we almost take for granted now, it was about creating the spectacle. It was about a moment of wonder. It was about beauty. It was about something delightful. Press a doorbell, doesn't just make a doorbell sound, there's like a woman who lights up standing right there. I mean, that's kind of nifty in a terrifying sort of way. So we know there's this moment, right, where even the technologies here had that similar affection. Now, not all of them end up so well. 1898, Marie Curie discovers radium. Good. Gets Nobel Prizes. Good. Many other people think radium's kind of nifty. It gets immediately named in the commercial press as eternal sunshine, because indeed it does glow. Many people try to commercialize it, so it comes out of medicine. So Marie Curie discovers radium. Radium moves into hospitals very quickly as a way of actually treating localized cancer. It then moves out of the hospitals into a whole series of other things. Radium-infused drinks, radium-infused lipstick, nail polish, blush, radium suppositories. I know, sunshine everywhere. And a whole series of other things, right? It becomes a piece of a series of musicals. So the musical Biff, Baff, Boff, who knew, was actually a musical all about radium. It had a thing in it called the Radium Dance. This is a grab from its program where the costumes were dipped in radium, and then put on the players and stuck them on stage. We know this doesn't end well, right? And truthfully, the kind of fascination with radium comes to an abrupt end in about 1925, when the radium dial factory in New Jersey, who had been creating watch faces first for the military and then for the consuming public, had a particularly gruesome lawsuit on their hands when they had taken a series of young women who are known in the kind of legal press as the radium girls, and they were taught to paint watch dials. So think about those of you who are old enough to have a watch dial. There are numbers on the dial. So they used to take this bowl of radium-infused material, stick the paintbrush in it, pull the paintbrush out, put the paintbrush in their mouths, pull it through their lips to get a fine point, and then paint the dials on the watch. The women who did this for several years. Unsurprisingly, the radium destroyed their jaws and their faces. They all died of gruesome radiation poisoning. And the lawsuit that was taken on their behalves is actually the first time we have labor laws in the US that start to set a standard about reasonable exposure to things. So this is why, photocopiers can't emit a certain amount of radiation. This became the test mark case that actually set in place a whole series of things that we enjoy today, right? But it also became one of these stories about how does something go from being wonderful to terrifying in less than 5 years. So we know there's this constant kind of cycling, right, of the things that are splendid also become the things that are very scary. So where does that leave you, right? Well, for me, I think it's about a couple of things. I actually think that there is a desire for magic. I think there's something inherently powerful about that moment. The first time a light bulb flickers on when you've never seen light in the night. The first time a television flickers and you see a story. The first time you went to the movies. The first time you see a photo. First time the radio came on. First time the telegraph arrived, the first time you heard a voice on a telephone, the first time we had a touch screen, the first time we got money out of an ATM. Those were all little tiny moments of wonder. Some of them lasted longer than others. But there's something really powerful about those moments of it being wonderful, where you kind of have that shiver run through you, where you go, oh my God, that's so cool. You have to go show it to someone else immediately, or drag them to the ATM, or turn the television on for them, or call them up and say, oh my God, this thing is like amazing, right? We know what that feeling feels like. As jaded as you all feel you are, you know what that moment is. You know that moment of it being wonderful, right? And we spend all of our time thinking about how to design things practically, whereas designing for wonder, I actually think, and magic, hugely important. Arthur C. Clarke, another science fiction writer, has a number of laws. I find the first two to be self-serving. The third one is useful. He says that any sufficiently advanced technology should be indistinguishable from magic. Of course, he doesn't have it quite right here, right? It's like any sufficiently advanced technology should deliver magic. It shouldn't be indistinguishable from it. What it ought to be aiming at is making magic possible. That moment of kind of wonder and surprise and delight and pleasure. It's not always about being practical and pragmatic and solving every problem. Sometimes there is something genuinely beautiful about our capacity to deliver magic and to deliver wonder. And I know, because I spend my time in this field, we often spend a lot of time thinking about how are we going to get things to be more real, more lifelike, more indistinguishable from ourselves or from the real. And I actually wonder if that's not the right idea. Famous Japanese roboticist says that the challenge with robotics is that there is this moment when they go from being very robot-like to being almost human but not quite human, and that almostness makes us really uncomfortable. He calls that the uncanny valley. That there is a moment where things don't feel quite right. And we have all understood it to mean we should rush through the uncanny valley as quickly as we could and get to things feeling right again. And I wonder if part of the way we might not get back to magic, to wonder, to the importance of those things is actually to linger just a little bit in places like the uncanny valley, in places where it is possible to imagine delight, in places where what we might be engineering for isn't always efficiency and practicality and high levels of usability, but also for a small moment of a fission of delight, of a little squeal of glee. I actually think those aren't bad things to imagine, should also be the targets of our work, right? Because for me, I do believe where I started this talk, right, that part of the function we all have, those of us who are teachers and in the industry, it is our job to think about those things. Those of you, one day you'll get to design these things. It's not just about what we design, it's about the stories we tell about what we design. And it's the stories we tell about what those designs will be. And it's the worlds we shape through our actions, through our words, through our visioning of the future that are hugely important. And for me, there's something really powerful in starting to imagine that it's not just about the work we do, it's about the stories we tell. And it would be, for me, kind of amazing to think that some of those stories we should tell are also going to be about a little bit of magic and a little bit of wonder. And a little bit of moment of Vaucanson's duck waddling across the stages of Europe. And of that moment of being kind of mesmerized by things. I actually don't think that's bad. I think there's something about our fascination with everything being explainable that makes us forget that sometimes what we desperately want as humans is a little bit of mystery and a little bit of magic. So my charge to all of you as you go through your careers here is that you have to help me think about how we deliver just a little bit of magic and a little bit of mystery. So thank you. Now there must be sugar. Yes. Do you really going to let him ask the first question?
It's paid.
Get paid to ask the first question? Wow.
So I'm trying to think through one particular aspect of this. The loom was a device that was ultimately, I think, understandable to people who were still against it, perhaps for societal applications. Whereas Terminator is, at some level, moving beyond this. I'm trying to come up with a term. The best I've been able to think of is sort of like the homuncular leap. Like at some level, we sort of abstract away and say, this is doing something we can't understand, and thus, we won't attempt to. And I wonder how much of this magic is lying in that leap. We can't understand what the robots are doing, and yet you look at something like Furby. I think a lot of people get the light out of this, even though it's a super simple state machine, because it evinces some signals that we interpret as humans.
Yeah, I think there's something about knowableness, but I also, think if you look back, particularly at clocks and watches, there was a moment when people didn't understand those either, right? Now, the moments may have been shorter in their duration. So the early invention of watches, right? Not everyone knew how to fix them. They were mysterious objects. How did they know what the time was? There were all these rituals that developed about winding them. That are all deep forms of magical thinking, right? If I wind it at this time, there's sort of activities there where I think it is absolutely the case that complexity is an important part of this story, right? As things get more complex and less visible, I think there's something about the casing of things that makes stuff more complicated. So, when Frankenstein gets a skin, or Frankenstein's monster gets a skin and all the innards are encased, I think there are pieces of what makes that more scary than if it had just been bones, right? As it gets closer to other objects, the complexity piece is an important piece there. And I think there is something about as things become more unknowable, there is certainly fear to it. But what's fascinating to me is that the fear precedes the levels of complexity, right? When you talk about the early kind of appearance of clock towers and of watches, there's already a discourse of anxiety, not yet full-blown fear, but there's a discourse of anxiety about what it means. People really weren't happy about clock towers either. There was a whole thing about, well, but how do we know that's and then the arguments about time, don't actually get resolved till the International Time Zone Conference finally resolves it all in the early 1900s. It's sort of amazing about how long it takes us to get to standard time. We have, 800 years of time, and then there is standardizing time, and the arguments about that are remarkably like the arguments about web addresses, about who gets to declare what has a suffix and what doesn't. So I think there's something about, it's not just about levels of complexity, it's about, my working theory here is that as you start to impact our relationships to time, space, and each other, those are moments when fear appears. And when you have something that does all three, lots of fear appears. And I think, the Terminator works in some ways as a trope of anxiety because it is rehearsing a whole set of other things, right? It is referring back to things that we're not even conscious of, right? In its replacement of humans, it is playing on the Luddite trope. In its, bodiness, it is playing on, Frankenstein. It's about, all this. Its ability to create fear or to be an object of that, or to be put up as an object of that, those all being different levels, right, is because it is playing on all those earlier tropes too, right, as those don't go away. So, the Terminator may have its own anxiety that it creates, but partly it works because the implicit reference.
We see more prosaic examples of this. Like the equivalent of a magical incantation today is someone taking a very specific set of steps as they use technology, because they know that if they do it this way, it does this.
Okay, so if I hold the laptop this way, I hold the signal better. If I have my phone out the window, exactly. I always, oh yeah, no, absolutely. And that's all about, those things never go away.
It's magic.
This was how we explained them. Really? No.
Okay.
The third bite of the apple.
She won't turn down the others if you, though.
I can't mind persistence. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I was thinking about how we study technology in our social interactions, like Twitter, Facebook, and how we're trying to kind of take what we already have from sociology and see how it expands in these fields. So I was thinking if you think that there is any place where technology can kind of bring a magical impact to how we interact with other people, or just something really new, and like the peacock that brings water out of his mouth, like something really innovative in how we interact with other people.
Well, I think there's been moments of that in the whole history of technology, right? I mean, they've done different things. I mean, I think television is a chronically underappreciated technology of magic and wonder, right? You know, not only did it changed the way we thought about stories, but it also changed how we talked to each other, what the medium of our interactions was. It created a whole set of kind of practices, and it did have that moment to it. I think, you know, the telephone is certainly part of all of that. Electricity, once it got past light bulbs, is very much a part of how did you create other possibilities for human interaction, right? And, you know, truthfully, you know, some of the stuff around light is really interesting that way, about, you know, the possibilities it created of being able to socialize after dark, of being able to think differently about food and food preparation. But, I mean, actually, for me, the stuff about whimsy, which is partly, you know, the peacock is for me in that tradition, that one's a harder one to come by. We've sort of, I mean, particularly, I think, the most interesting experiments I've seen with that either come out of Japan, Korea, a little bit out of places like the Royal College of Art in London, where there's an ability to think that not all technology needs to be about problem solving. Sometimes it's just about fun. And, you know, truthfully think about, you know, some of the most persistent technologies, services, and applications. And, you know, Angry Birds is more popular than the American Tax Office website. Now, one of those is practical, one of those is clearly not. You know, Candy Crush the same, right? I mean, those are about pleasure activities, not just about practical activities. So there's something about, you know, we know how to design for pleasure in the content space. We know how to design for wonder and whimsy in some of the industrial design space. I mean, there were certainly, you know, moments of visceral pleasure that people got from Jonathan Ives' designs in the first generation of the iPod and the iPhone and the tablet, right? They were clearly moments of aesthetic pleasure. Not quite the same as wonder or magic, but, you know, there was a kind of a pleasurableness to that. So I think we know how to think about that, at least in some ways in terms of industrial design and a little bit in the application space. I think it's interesting to imagine what does that also look like in the technology space, in the interaction space, and rather than thinking that everything is about practicalness. I mean, for me, there's sort of a piece about, and maybe it's partly that I work with engineers who are very interested in explaining and wanting to make all the science visible. I'm like, no, like, literally put a lid on it. People actually want to have a moment where they don't need to know how it works, right? There's something about the fact that we've come out of a period of time in computational devices where the devices insist on telling you everything. Where you're just like, why? Stop telling me you're connecting to the network. I don't care, I just want it to happen. So there's something about, you know, how do we imagine a different set of possibilities there that for me is sort of interesting. But I also suspect it's one where we need to cast a net much more broadly. I mean, I think about what Docomo was doing in Tokyo 12 years ago, some of what was happening on SciWorld 10 years ago. There were some really interesting things going on in those spaces that aren't necessarily what happened on AT&T's network or Facebook. Yes, you who knew the answers to every slide before I finished them. Yes.
So you said obviously there are a lot of cultural differences. Like, for example, here in the West, we have things like Bill Joy's article, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. And then in Japan, they have signs that say robots are our friend. Have you actually looked into any difference in terms of generational differences? Like, for example, the way people my age as a freshman in college view technology as opposed to people who have graduated college 20 years ago?
Yeah, some of it is absolutely generational. What's interesting is while there are different generational tolerances of technology, the anxieties manifest themselves in almost exactly the same way. So, you know, every new technology brings with it the same set of rhetorical anxieties. And the language is almost identical. There's some lovely stuff that was done when Congress was considering legislation to mandate a particular infrastructure, right? And so they're debating this. And there's this incredible anxiety that if they mandate this particular infrastructure, it's going to make women and children incredibly vulnerable to predators. And that it would be bad if every household had this technology because they'd be vulnerable. Now, that technology is electricity. And the argument was if houses had electricity, the light would be on so predators could see women and children at night and then attack them. You're like, really? And then think about the kind of conversations we have about the internet, about, you know, when electricity was first coming out, one of the conversations that went on in the pages of things like the Washington Post and the New York Times was that electrifying people's homes would be terrible because they would never leave their homes again, and it would be the death of the family because they'd all go to their rooms and never socialize. It would be the death of the town because they'd never leave their homes, and everyone would just revert to individualist practice, so there'd be no more America. You're like, it's a light bulb. light bulb. Like, you know, but it got this incredible kind of work put on it. I think what's fascinating is generationally irrespective, while you may have grown up with a whole set of technologies, the next disruptive technology will provoke in you a not dissimilar set of anxieties, because those anxieties are cultural logics, they are not generational logics. What the technology is that provokes the anxiety will be completely different. I can guarantee you it will be much more about things like always on, always connected, always sensing camera surveillance technology, not about electricity. But I can guarantee you there'll be a similar set of conversational and rhetorical responses to it.
Yeah, I'm curious, you mentioned camera surveillance. It seems to me that, for me at least, in today's world, the fear side of this is not the technology to be afraid of, but that it arms people who you are afraid of. So drones and surveillance, I mean, those are the tropes of fear now more than autonomous robots.
Well, what's fascinating is they made clear one of the things that was unclear, I think, in the 200 intervening years, which was that someone had to program all the things, right? Robots weren't self-programming. So if they were going to kill you, that was because we programmed them to kill you or kill ourselves. And there's been something interesting about that pivot point, about where the next round of technological anxieties are. And some of it, you're right, is about who has the data, but some of it's about what does it mean to have surveilling objects. So think about, you know, some of the responses, and I've seen just a little bit of it recently, of people putting Band-Aids over camera lenses on laptops. And the kind of, you know, notions of what does it mean to start thinking about our platforms as being always on and always sensing. So my working hypothesis here is that we are going through a moment where the fear is moved to a particular place, but I don't think it's gone from the devices entirely, right? Tulsi.
I was just wondering, like, do you think there is, obviously anytime you start having disruptive technology that comes with anxiety and fear, but is there a point where there's too much magic, where we actually should be stopping with the iterativeness because we are actually approaching things where people should be afraid?
Yeah, I think you can't stop it, right? But I think in the Western tradition, there's a cycle, right? Where there's like this moment of everyone is like, wow, it's like radium, eternal sunshine, excellent, must have lots. And then there's oh, that was bad. And there's kind of okay, probably just in these spaces, right? So I do think there is an arc that moves, but the arc tends to move from a kind of boosterism and an unreasonable expectation and a kind of hype through oh crap, bad, back to a kind of like a steady state, right? But I don't know many technologies, once they hit either a scale or they have a real potential, that don't have something like that, right? I mean, we're clearly in the middle of several of them at the moment, right? Think about big data. We've clearly gone through the hype and we are now going through the I think wearable technology is still in the hype, not yet in the There's sort of something about, you know, where do they sort of settle out?
Articles about Google Glass.
Yes, well, I think it's moving. It's the sort of the early adopter right? Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Thus far, none of those skills have stood me in good stead at Intel. I remain hopeful. It turns out if you know how to get water out of frogs, it's a good line for cocktail party conversation. It has not yet helped me innovate new technology. But it does mean I have spent pretty much all of my life thinking about culture, and increasingly over the last 15 or 20 years thinking about its relationship to technology. And when I think about the notion of the fact that my work at Intel, and indeed many of us who work in the HCI field, our work is to think about what that intersection looks like, right? And to think about how it is we shape technologies and technical systems that will in some ways comport to humans rather than making humans do all the work the other way around. But I think in addition to the practical work of building technologies and building systems, there's also a piece that all of us engage in, and you will engage in as you leave this building and you go into the rest of your lives, is that it's also about shaping the imagination. It's not just about physically building things, it's about what are the stories we tell about what technology does. What are the stories we tell and are told about our relationships to technology? And I want to kind of think of that as the work of the socio-technical, the work of the kind of the imaginary new world that we are all talking about, the future we are perennially designing for. And there are lots of ways to think about this. I was in England last week, and William Gibson put this on Twitter, and I thought it was a kind of fabulous line. Here is William Gibson saying he woke up from a dream in which he appeared to be entirely in Google Street Views. Now, those of you who don't know William Gibson, he is, probably one of our more distinguished social science writers. He certainly gave us a whole series of tropes that many of us operate in today when we think about how data is configured, when we think about our relationships to many things. William Gibson is one of them, who helped shape those. And it is fascinating to me to imagine that here is a man who finds himself in some ways held hostage to a system, and a socio-technical one at that. So when I think about charting the socio-technical imagination, I think about the stories we tell about technology. This was a starting point for me. But truthfully, when I really started thinking about this work, it had to do with this. So this is a piece of video that turned up on YouTube at this point about 2 Christmases ago, so in December of, what would that be, 2011. It showed a Furby. Most of you in this room are not old enough to remember the original one, but it was a little talky thing, and its little eyelashes flashes and its ears went and made a horrible squeaking sound. This is a Furby talking to Siri, so Apple's first generation speech recognition personal assistant object. This is 47 seconds of video in which predictably the Furby goes, "Ah!" and Siri says, "Would you like me to call Shell Oil?" And the Furby goes, "Ah, ah, 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 ah," and Siri says something to the effect of, "I can't find Graham in your address book." Now, this is obviously funny, but it also captured me and I couldn't let go of it. And I spent multiple days wanting to show this video to everyone I knew. And I realized that part of what made it appealing to me is that this is actually not just an amusing piece of video. This is in fact encoding a very particular moment in our relationships to technology. Because this is actually about genealogy, right? This is about 3 different kinds of genealogy. The first one is this is a story about talking things. It's like granddaddy talking thing and baby talking thing, because clearly the Furby and the Siri, slightly more sophisticated in that generational transformation, right? It's also a genealogy in the classic anthropological sense, so think the tree of humanity, where we have basically Neanderthal talking thing and Homo sapien talking thing, where there's a clear and structural difference. But it turned out there was another thing going on in this that only became clear to me when I started to talk to the engineers that I work with at Intel. Because I said to them, "This is fabulous." And they're like, "That's nice." And I'm like, "No, it's really very cool." They're like, "That's nice." I'm like, "No, there's something going on here." Because what we have in the difference between the Furby and the Siri is the difference between talking and listening. The Furby talks, what the Siri proposes to do is listen. Talk also, but listen, because the talking is a response to the listening. And as soon as you have that transformation, you have the promise of something that listens to you. It's effectively, for better or worse, and in this case possibly not implemented excellently, it is the promise of something that has a relationship with you, because it's listening to you and responding to you. Ultimately, it is something that promises to take care of you. It will anticipate your needs and deliver something to you. And I went to my engineers and I said, "Listen, I think this is imperfectly pointing to the beginning of a move from human-computer interaction to human-computer relationships. And that what this actually does is signal the beginning of a significant paradigm shift in the way we ought to be thinking about ourselves and machines." And my engineers, who are lovely people, said to me, "No." I'm like, "What do you mean, no?" They're like, "Nope." I'm like, "Why no?" They're like, "Well, if we have a relationship with machines, nothing good will come of it." I'm like, "What does that mean?" They're like, "Well, if machines are smart enough to have a relationship with us, you know what happens next." And I'm like, "No." They're like, "Death." Like, I'm sorry, how have we gone from human-computer interaction to death? And they're like, "It's really quite simple. As soon as they're smart enough to take care of us, they're smart enough to kill us." And I realized that what this was also pointing to me was a third thing, right? This was also about a genealogy of anxiety. That somehow we had gotten to a moment where we could do this in our heads. We could go from happy, perky Furby, who really doesn't mean a lot of harm, to Siri, whose voice recognition, to that. Because that's what people were doing. There was a slippage and a slippery slope that went from saying, it's fine for an object to talk, it's probably okay for an object to listen. At the moment an object can start having a relationship with us and that object is a machine, death. And I'm like, wow. And so I've spent the last 18 months trying to make sense of that, because that for me is a really interesting move, right? How do we chart where that fear comes from? Because rationally, you know, Siri does not want to kill you. The Furby definitely didn't want to kill you. Chances are Google Plus doesn't want to kill you either. So why is it that we imagine that they are portents of like the end of the world, or at least the end of us? And I realized that part of what's going on here is what I actually think is the first move that happens, the move that gets us to a moment of fearing a relationship is actually about the death of magic. And to get to that moment, you have to go back in time. And you have to look at the emergence of 3 critical technologies in the 1600s, late 1500s, early 1600s, that profoundly shaped our relationships to the world. The first one of those objects is actually the watch. This is the very first watch, somewhere from the mid-1500s, talking about 1530 here. Before 1530, if you lived in pretty much any major metropolitan center around the world, there were different ways by which time was reckoned. If you lived in the West, you lived in a medieval village or a medieval city-state town. There was a large clock tower somewhere in that town. It was possibly associated with a church, and it chimed the time. It told you that it was the middle of the day. It sometimes told you it was time to pray. We thank the glorious introduction, and I say thank you. It's always fun to be back at Stanford, and it's fun to be in this particular lecture hall. I gave a talk here many years ago, so it's kind of fun to be back knocking around Stanford again. Michael is right. This is not a talk about what my lab does. If you're interested in that, you can send me email. This is actually me starting to think about my next project, and I'm really sort of interested in starting to think about our relationships with, through, and of technology. This is really a talk about the kind of construction of the socio-technical imagination. This isn't a talk about ethnography. This isn't a talk about HCI. So you're going to have to bear with me because I'm going to take you on a rapid and somewhat fast-paced journey through the last 500 years of history. So those of you who didn't pay attention in other classes, you're going to be really grateful to me when we're done because you're going to know a whole lot of people you didn't know about beforehand. Lots of ways to introduce me. Michael certainly gave you one. I am indeed the Director of Interaction and Experience Research at Intel. I have been at Intel 15 years, 2 weeks ago. My job there has always been to bring stories from outside the building into the building and to talk about what it is that motivates people, what they care about, what frustrates them, what's important to them, what they wish for their families and their kids and their communities and their cultures. And then we use all of that at Intel to help shape the next generation of technology production. I came to Intel in a kind of roundabout way. I was indeed an anthropologist. I did my PhD here. I studied Native American Studies as my undergraduate degree. And then in true Australian fashion, I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998. The bar is sadly long gone. And the man did not marry me, which was good also. But he did introduce me to Intel and to a different set of preoccupations. But long before I did that, I'm also the child of an anthropologist. So I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia. I spent most of the 1970s and 1980s living with Indigenous people who remembered their country before white fellas came and who at the drop of a hat would take my brother and I bush, and we spent most of, well, my childhood not in school, not wearing shoes, not speaking English, and killing anything around me that moved for my supper. If you were in that township, you heard time. Time was something you couldn't escape. It happened, you know, over a 300-year period. We went from time being a very diffuse thing to clock towers that originally started in churches and then become secular things. But if you lived in a town, which indeed was where most people lived in the 1500s, you heard time. Time was around you. If you lived in other parts of the world, there are other ways of knowing time. There were other kinds of clocks. In Islamic countries, there were water clocks. Those also made time visible in all kinds of ways, right? But you had to go to see that time or hear it. What the watch does is time suddenly becomes personal. Time now follows you. You know what time it is when you don't hear the time because you have the time in your pocket. And effectively, you start to be regulated by that notion of time because there are obligations about it. As soon as you carry time with you, you have no excuse for being tardy. If you carry a watch, not only does it say that you know how to be timely, but it says you care about punctuality. And a whole kind of notion here of what had in some ways been diffuse and free-floating, i.e. the notion of time, suddenly regulates us. So along comes the watch. Time is on our bodies. Sure, initially it starts that time is only in the hands of wealthy people. But it turns out you don't need to have that much time in the hands of wealthy people before most people can get close to time, because it's like early cell phones. Not everyone needed to have them, but everyone knew what they looked like and everyone had made a call. So the first thing that happens to start making magic disappear is that we put time in our hands. Second thing is a man named Galileo, riffing on some technology that had been built by some of his colleagues 6 months before in a different city for a different king, effectively invents something called the telescope. And the telescope makes possible the second important piece of the death of magic, because what the telescope lets us know is where our place in the world is. So in 1608 through 1609 through 1610, the leaders of many European nations find themselves gazing through a little tiny metal hole into the rest of the world, into the rest of this entire kind of planetary system. And one of the consequences that